So, right. So thank you, Becky, for taking the time to talk to us. I'm just waiting for oh, here's my message. There we go. Um, and so Becky is the Development and Technical Director um, of Farm Carbon Toolkit. And we're going to hear how they're supporting farmers, understanding their carbon footprint, working on the carbon footprint, and looking to the future. And obviously, it's a particularly interesting time. Uh, we've had a lot in the news, have we not, with inheritance tax, and we will have a lot in the news again tomorrow with the farmers' lobby. I know we've already had the Welsh farmers' lobby. Was that yesterday or Saturday? But tomorrow there'll be a big farmers' lobby. So I think farmers are becoming much more visible and vocal and on social media and all these things than they ever have been in the past. So far away, Becky, and please tell us what you've been up to and what the future holds.
Thank you very much. I'll just stick up some slides if that's all right, just to try and keep me on track. But yeah, thank you ever so much for inviting me to come along. It's lovely to be here with you all. So yeah, as Claire said, my name's Becky. I work for an organisation called the Farm Carbon Toolkit. So we have been around since 2008, and our real aim is to try and provide practical tools and resources for farmers around all the fun stuff: reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy resilience, improving business resilience, with a particular focus on soil health. And so I will just to say, hopefully give you a little bit of an overview. What you'll learn quite quickly is that I am a complete and utter carbon sado. This is my favourite topic. I can talk about it all for days and days and days. But Claire has kept me to 20 minutes. So again, what I'm going to try and do is just give you a little bit of a flavour of what we do and how we work with farmers and some of the issues, and hopefully then really open the floor up to lots of discussions. So again, if I don't mention something that you're really interested in, or you've got a question or a bugbear, all those sorts of things, please do engage, after I've finished wittering, because again, it's probably that it's there. I've just tried to keep it so that we're not going to be here all evening. But as I said, I suppose we've been active in this space since 2008. Just after the Climate Change Act came out, because it was felt there was lots of information about why farmers should do something around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but there was very little if you were a farmer and said, what practically can I actually do and what difference is it going to make? And so that's very much where we came from, and as a provide those tools and resources that can help farmers understand what they can do from a management perspective. Where we differ to some other organisations and not-for-profits, but also we were set up by farmers for farmers, because we really think that farmers talking to farmers is the best way to make change happen. Supporting each other is really, really important. So that's very much where we came from. In terms of, I've been involved with the organisation for about the last 10 years. So really sort of being out there, sitting around kitchen tables with farmers, helping them understand how this can really feed into what they're trying to do more generally with their farm. How does this align with where they're trying to take their farm? It can provide another lens to look at their business through. Previously to that, so I've been involved in sort of carbon and resource management-y type stuff for about the last 15 years. Previously to that was managing dairy farms, and had a little stint in between doing a little bit of policy development agencies, looking at giving European funding to farmers. So very much, this has been my world for a fair few years now. I spent 2 years substantially increasing my own carbon footprint, flying around the world doing a Nuffield scholarship, looking at this topic in terms of how do we communicate carbon reduction schemes to farmers? Because if you think back to where we were in 2016, we would put on do talks and all those sorts of things, and very few people would turn up, because farmers didn't really understand the relevance to their back.
You're breaking up, Becky. You are breaking up.
You are breaking up. Not terribly, but it's sort of intermittent.
Oh, I'm really sorry. What I might do is just turn my video off and see if that helps, if that's okay.
Okay.
Please just do shout at me if it's still getting horrendous, and I'll literally go and sit on top of the router. But yeah, very much aim to try and understand how we talk about this in a way which engages farmers. Because 2016 to where we are now, obviously things have changed dramatically in terms of carbon. Very much is lots more discussions going on from a policy perspective. We've had the evolution of carbon markets, and also, as you were just chatting about before we started, opinion about dietary choice, all those other sorts of things have meant that the environmental impact of agriculture has never really been more at the forefront than it is today. Toolkit. Well, the two main resources are our carbon calculator that allows us to be able to calculate what's going on and quantify where emissions are coming from, looking at where those farmers might be sequestering or removing carbon as well. Measurement isn't just what we do, because measurement can only get you a toolkit with good, or is it bad? Where are those areas where you might be able to make changes and improvements, both in terms of to reduce emissions and improve? A lot of time doing applied research, so we have a range of different trials and projects that are going on farm, really trying to intricacies of what are those management practices that we can change and what the impact is going to have. Sampling soil and looking at doing carbon testing.
Becky, sorry, can I interrupt again? You're breaking up, so we're missing quite a lot. I'm not quite sure how to deal with it, but we're missing quite a few bits and bobs. I don't know what we can do about that.
Oh dear, I'm sorry. Okay, right. I will, as I say, I've just moved location again, so hopefully this is going to be better, but please just shout at me if it's not, okay? So right, so we also spend a lot of time doing soil sampling and carbon testing to be able to quantify what's happening in terms of carbon that is within the soil and how that's changing over time depending on management. A lot of time trying to create networks and share knowledge. So as I said earlier, really acknowledging the fact that farmers talking to farmers is the best way to make change happen. So how do we facilitate groups of farmers to come together to understand what's possible? We run the Soil Farmer of the Year competition, really aimed at championing those farmers who are doing wonderful things around sustainable soils management. Now, that competition opens each year on World Soils Day. And for any of you that haven't got World Soils Day already ringed in your calendar as a day where very exciting things happen, it is coming up before too long. It is the 5th of December. And then we ran a range of strategic projects. So we have a project called Farm Net Zero, which really aims to champion and showcase the opportunities that farmers have to achieve net zero. We have 3 demonstration farms with the aim of getting them to net zero by next year, and they're well on the way to doing that. And then a range of 40 monitor farms with the aim of them reducing their emissions by 30% and at the same time reducing their costs of production alongside that by another 10% to try and show the economic benefits. We work with different landowners and landlords. So we have a project with the Duchy of Cornwall, helping them to understand and footprint all of their tenant farmers and then help them transition to net zero by 2035. We work across supply chains. We work with different areas, national parks, all that sort of stuff to really try and help farmers. So let's just make sure we're all on the same page in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And although a lot of the language and a lot of the rhetoric around this topic very much is around carbon, we talk about carbon footprinting, net zero carbon, all of those other sorts of things. When we think about agriculture, actually the emissions from carbon dioxide are a very small proportion of the overall emissions. If we look at the UK as a whole, agriculture contributes about 1.4% of carbon dioxide emissions. The vast majority of the emissions from agriculture are coming from 2 other gases. They're coming from methane and they're coming from nitrous oxide. And the combination of those 3 gases together makes up agriculture's contribution to UK PLC footprint, and agriculture currently contributes about 12% of UK emissions. Now, there's a really interesting couple of things to think about here. Now, number one is that for farmers in this sort of stuff, well, even if they're not, oh, Julian, are you okay? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, just a quick question while we're here to clarify how you're measuring those percentages. Is it by CO2 equivalent over 100 years? Or
Yes,
is it by what?
so absolutely. So these are all measured using GWP 100, so the global warming potential of these gases over 100 years. And then obviously that then goes into their carbon dioxide equivalent, which is what we have to do because we are one of those odd industries where not all of our gases are coming from carbon dioxide. So for those non-carbon dioxide gases, we have to convert them into their carbon dioxide equivalent. And the way that we have to do that currently is that we have to use their global warming potential over 100 years. But you make a really good point in terms of, especially when we start thinking about methane, and we can absolutely pick this up in the discussion in a minute, we know that methane doesn't persist over 100 years. So thinking about alternative ways of measuring it is something that we're doing at the moment. So even if we're not interested in any of this sort of stuff from a climate perspective, for farmers, their motivations very much can be and from an efficiency perspective, because there is a really good link between management of our carbon footprint on farm and how efficient our business is in terms of its management of its resources. So if you do this for no other reason, farmers will save money. Okay, and often that economic incentive is a really good starting point to have those conversations if they're potentially not that fast about what's going on from a climate perspective. But there isn't one magic management practice that all farmers can go away and do and is going to have the same impact, okay? Unlike other sectors where a lot of the time we can put a concrete wall around what's going on and we're just dealing with carbon dioxide, as we can just see within agriculture, we're dealing with this complex interplay between these three different gases, okay? Each farm is unique. Each farm is a unique combination of what's under the ground in terms of their soil type, what falls out the sky in terms of their climatic conditions, and what the farmer does in the middle. Okay, so you often hear the saying, there isn't one silver bullet, there isn't one thing that we can do across agriculture that's going to solve the issue. Agriculture is a complicated industry, okay? It's also compounded by the fact that actually agriculture is linked to our carbon and nitrogen cycles. So if you were to go out tomorrow and get rid of all agricultural activity off the landscape, our landscapes would still be producing these gases as a result of that carbon and nitrogen cycle. So we're never going to totally eliminate greenhouse gas emissions associated with agriculture, okay? But before we all get too depressed, agriculture is the only industry that is also able to deliver solutions through how we manage our land and through how much carbon we can take out of the atmosphere. It's also important to remember that we're not just producing these emissions for the sake of producing these emissions, we're producing them because we're producing food, okay? And that's a part that's often forgotten when we're having. It's quite difficult to measure because we're not just dealing with one gas, we're dealing with three gases, and it's dependent on the weather because it's one of these biological systems. So when we have a winter like we had last winter where it basically didn't stop raining for 6 months, our soils are emitting nitrous oxide irrespective of what we do off the top of them because those soils are full of water. So we've got this sort of leaky system that is dependent on these biological cycles, compounded by the variation in terms of what we do on top of it. But we will carry on. We will not be daunted by that. So where are those gases actually coming from? Well, let's think about those for a minute. Now, nitrous oxide is a gas that people don't really spend a lot of time thinking about. But for us within agriculture, it's quite a big deal. And it's a big deal for two reasons. Firstly, because as a gas, it's about 270 times more potent in terms of its ability to cause global temperature rise than carbon dioxide is. And in terms of a percentage, about 70% of nitrous oxide emissions come from agriculture, okay? So we can have lots of discussions about methane and all of those sorts of things, but with nitrous oxide, we absolutely have to own that because 70% of it's coming from agriculture. Now, within that 70%, there is a proportion of that, about 60, if you were to make that 70%, 100%, about 60% of it is coming from natural sources. So that's the nitrogen cycle going on, that's emissions that are coming from soils. And then the other bit is the man-made bit, and that's very much coming from the manufacture of fertilizer, what we do in terms of our applications of fertilizer on the ground, and also what we're doing around manure. So very much coming from soils, fertilizers, and our manures. Methane are much maligned ruminant animals. 98% of the methane that comes out of a cow or a sheep comes out the front end, not the back end, as we're often led to believe. And it's a loss of potential energy that that animal could be using to grow more meat or milk, okay? What's also often forgotten about with methane is it's not just produced from the animals as a result of those animals being able to turn something we can't eat in terms of grass into something that we can. It's also produced from how we manage, store and apply our manures and slurries. So even our non-ruminant farmers, so our pig and our poultry farmers, are also producing methane through how they're managing their manure. And there's lots of opportunities to do things in terms of reducing methane as well as thinking about how we measure it. And then there's carbon dioxide, the gas which most other industries are dealing with, very much focusing on the burning of fossil fuels. So on farm, that's very much thinking about on-farm diesel usage, potentially electricity, generating your own renewable energy if you can, and then also what's going on within the soil in terms of when we cultivate or when we turn that soil over, that sudden sort of influx of oxygen into our soil stimulates those soil microbes that live there to start respiring madly, and obviously a byproduct of that respiration is carbon, which comes up. But if we manage our soils in a different way, we have the ability to improve the carbon stocks within our soil and actually start to deliver that solution to climate change. There's lots of reasons why farmers would manage carbon on the farm. We've obviously got policy and legislation options in terms of obviously the UK net zero strategy. The NFU have said that as an industry, we're going to get there 10 years earlier. So agriculture is going to be net zero by 2040. And there's lots of other interest in terms of as supply chains start to declare their net zero credentials, realizing that a key proportion of their emissions are coming from the farmers that supply them, as well as local communities that are declaring climate emergencies and wanting to look at the opportunities to work with farmers in their local area. So there's all that big stuff in terms of the bigger picture bits. But if we zoom back down and think about why manage carbon at a farm level, well, it makes business sense. As I say, there's a unique relationship between efficient use of resources and a reduction in our carbon footprint. So it will help our business become more resilient. It allows us to be more informed and make better decisions. So when we're thinking about what might we do on our farm in the future, as well as evaluating it from a financial perspective and a practical perspective, we can also evaluate it from a carbon perspective. It enables a positive narrative. And we really need a positive narrative for our industry at the moment. By looking at what we're doing from a farming perspective, by understanding the changes that we're making and the impact that that's having on our carbon footprint, we can absolutely start to change that conversation and highlight some of the positive things that are happening. It creates more resilient businesses and it allows our businesses to be more future-proof. So at the moment, a high proportion of our dairy farms, for example, are having to complete their carbon footprint because their milk processors are asking it. And as other sectors of agriculture start to get more formalized in that process, if you can have a look at managing carbon on the farm now, it puts you on that front foot for when your suppliers or your neighbours come calling asking you what's going on. And that whole process of managing carbon on the farm starts by being able to measure it, because that old adage of you can't manage what you don't measure is really, really important. And although for most farmers, the idea of completing their carbon footprint is not something that fills them with joy. I am that sad. I love doing it. It is my favorite thing to do. But for most farmers, it's not. It is that first step in being able to quantify the contribution that that farm is making to climate change. And carbon footprinting farms has a sort of reputation as being something which is massively difficult and massively complicated. And there's 25 million different footprinting tools that you can use, and they're all going to tell you different results. But at the simplest level, all a carbon footprint calculator is doing is it's identifying the amount and the source of those 3 different greenhouse gas emissions. So carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide that are emitted from the farm, and then highlights areas where you might be able to make improvements or changes to reduce it. It should also highlight where you're currently sequestering carbon and shows you some offsetting options and allows you to evaluate future projects. They allow you to become more aware and make more informed decisions, as I've said already. But those metrics or those calculations are relevant. So they need to make sense to your business. They need to be practical. They need to be consistent. And they also need to be that first step in terms of informing behavioural change. So the process of doing your carbon calculator shouldn't be so hideous that you have to go and lie down in a darkened room for 3 weeks to get over it. It's that first step in terms of saying, so what does this information tell me and what can I do with it moving forward? Just sort of picking up on Julian's point at the beginning in terms of, are all gases created equal? And one of the challenges that we have when we've got the current way of measuring greenhouse gas emissions is that we currently look at the potency of these gases over 100 years. And this is one of the challenges, especially when we start looking at footprinting livestock farms, is that we know that actually methane is not a long-lived climate pollutant. So it does not persist in the atmosphere over those 100 years. It's a much more pulsy gas. So it has an initial pulse between about 9 and 12 years, and then it is reabsorbed back into the system. And so what this means is that actually the way that we are currently accounting for methane potentially is not representing that behaviour in the atmosphere. So what's been going on over the last few years is actually the development of a different way for accounting for methane, which rather than just saying that actually when those those emissions go up into the atmosphere, they persist there, is much more able to take account of that cyclical nature, and is really, really important, specifically when we think about livestock. This work was done by a guy called Miles Allen at the University of Oxford. He was very much looking at it at a global level, so looking at the impact of global livestock numbers on global temperature rise. And his modelling basically says that if you got rid of all ruminant animals off the planet tomorrow, the impact on global temperature rise would actually mean that it would only reduce that global temperature rise by 1/10 of a degree. Okay, so you'd be quite a dramatic impact to have something which was, in terms of warming impact, was not going to have a massive impact. So there's work going on at the moment to look at how do we better adapt carbon calculators to be able to understand the different behaviour of different gases. And I'll happily pick that up in a minute when we get to questions. So how do farmers complete a carbon footprint? Well, there's two different stages of that. They collect all of their data and they put it into the calculator. They then get a result, and then they should really spend that time then interpreting the results and understanding what does that look like. Now, what tends to happen, and the challenge often, is that the data entry bit of the calculator tends to scare a lot of farmers off. It's perceived to be something that's going to take a huge amount of time. You need to do lots and lots of bits of information. But this is the sort of the bit that needs to get through to get to the interesting bit, which is actually, what do the results tell me and how can I use that to develop a strategy for my farm? Because interpreting the results of your footprint is a key part of that process. It's not just about doing the actual measurement, and then what that means in terms of being able to develop a strategy for your farm for reducing emissions and improving sequestration in the future is really important. It gives you a baseline. It allows you to put that stake in the ground and be able to understand how close you are to net zero, whether you are emitting, all those other sorts of things. Allows you to be more informed, and it gives you that evidence in terms of changing management. So what's really exciting in the work that I do is that, yes, you get to the point where you have a baseline with a farmer, and then you start to say, well, okay, what can we change? And you do some scenario planning and you feed figures into the calculator. And it's almost like you can sort of see the lights start to turn on in terms of understanding that they have the ability to to do that positive change through what they're doing is really, really important. So what can we actually do about it? And that process really starts by thinking about, well, where do the majority of the emissions come from? And you can see on those two pie charts there how the emissions break down for your typical arable farm or for your typical ruminant farm. And you can see that for arable farms, we're very much focusing on nitrogen, both the production of that nitrogen and then the application when it gets onto the farm, which is contributing about 60%, and then also fuel use. So when we're thinking about mitigation options for arable farmers, we are very much talking about nitrogen use efficiency, and we're talking about cultivation options. If you look on the other side in terms of ruminant farms, we can see that about half of those emissions are coming from the animal themselves in terms of enteric fermentation. The other half very much is around how we're managing our manures, what we're doing around fertilizer, feed and fuel. And that's the side that we tend to concentrate on in terms of mitigation. Just then looking at a couple of examples, we can see these are real life examples of different farms and where the emissions are coming from in terms of different categories. So we can see this is a livestock farm example where about 70% of their emissions are coming from the animals themselves and what they're doing around manure and feed and those sorts of things. And then we can see the other breakdown. But remembering that it's not just to count the emissions. Our farms are also capable of sequestering carbon. And so on the other side, where you can see on those green tables, you can see that the farm is managing their habitats, their hedges. They've got areas of woodland, and then what's happening from a soil perspective. You've then got a mixed farm example there, and you can see on this farm, actually what they're doing with their soils in terms of building soil organic matter is actually meaning that the farm is beyond net zero. So you can see at the top there, this farm has a carbon footprint of minus 996 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, because they're making those changes in their soils to mean that actually the carbon that's being captured in their soils is more than offsetting those emissions that are coming from what they're doing from the on the arable operations. An arable farm example here, again, looking at the proportion where the majority of the emissions are coming. Here you can see, as within that first pie chart, we've got over half of the emissions coming from fertilizer and about 25% of the emissions coming from fuel. So when we're talking to farmers, we then use these tables to say, where might we want to focus our efforts moving forward? Right, I'm just going to skip through because we're almost there. So there's lots of things that we can talk about in terms of management, in terms of optimizing performance. So how efficiently is that farm being managed? Where are there areas where actually we can improve that efficiency? And this is often where a lot of the cost saving options come in as well. Thinking about how we're managing our soils, our fertilizers and our manures. So really focusing on nitrogen use efficiency, making sure our soils are in a really good structure to make sure that not only will they do that carbon sequestration, but on the other side, we will allow nutrient cycling, water holding, all those other things that we want to happen within our soils. Managing energy and fuel use. Again, really good opportunity here to think about reducing costs, especially with the volatility of input energy costs and fuel costs onto the farm, like we're all seeing within our households as well. Thinking about renewable energy. So if renewable energy generation is an option for farms. And then finally, thinking about maximising sequestration, because as you'll have seen on that little example that I just put up earlier, you don't need to be doing very much in terms of building soil organic matter to actually have a real impact in terms of improved sequestration. There are lots of things that we can do in terms of enhancing the natural capital of our farms through management of our hedgerows, our field margins, our land that is currently in stewardship schemes, so whether we're providing habitats for pollinators or invertebrates. Thinking about incorporating trees into pasture land, which will provide really good opportunities for shade and shelter for livestock, as well as sequestration. Thinking about the diversity of grass species that we have within our grasslands, really thinking about whether we can incorporate more deeper rooting species. And then also the use of cover and companion cropping. So making sure that we are maximising the opportunities to do that photosynthesis through having something there that can capture that sunlight and turn that into carbon dioxide. And we've been doing a lot of work looking at how we measure soil carbon. It can be something that can be seen as very challenging, but from sitting and standing in thousands of holes and from pulling all that work together, what have we found is that we can measure soil carbon. And more importantly, farmers can build soil carbon. But the really important bit is how they're managing that land has an impact. So it's not just about saying, I've got grassland, therefore I'm doing a good thing, or I've got an arable field, therefore I'm doing a good thing. It's actually about incorporating how those fields are being managed to be able to understand what we can do better. And it's also important to remember that we need to look at this at a whole farm footprint level. So it's been a little bit of a gallop through, and apologies if the internet was a bit rubbish at the start. Sort of hopefully given you a bit of a flavour of some of the work that we do. So to try and bring it together, we know that, our farmers and growers are at the front line of climate change, both in terms of because they are an industry that is very, very vulnerable to the changing weather patterns in terms of having to adapt their farming systems, but also because we are able to deliver solutions through how we manage our land. So by completing carbon footprints and understanding what's going on in terms of providing that baseline, farmers are able to understand where they can start, what the starting point is, and then start to explore some of the options for both reducing emissions and improving sequestration. And a lot of the work that we do is about helping them do that baselining, providing that evidence to be able for them to understand where they are as a starting point, empower them to understand the ability to change, and then also helping support them to deliver that change through that ongoing support, which allows us to provide those positive narratives and also to help identify areas where we need more research. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and then, yeah, if you want to, we can have a discussion. And apologies, I know I galloped through those slides, so I'm very happy to send them if anybody wants to look at them in a bit more detail afterwards.
That would be great. I can see Julian putting his thumb up to that. Thanks very much, Becky. That was such a positive presentation in terms of. I'm assuming you're presenting to us, but you're. I'm assuming it's allied to what you present to farmers to be able to say this isn't going to be as difficult as you think. If I could just start the questions by saying recently I was on a sort of typical diversified farm, if you like, insofar as I had to go to an event, into a big event space which had been converted from a barn, and it was a wonderful new space there. We all arrived with our cars into a quite remote place and all the rest of it. So my thought was, bearing my recent experience, was when farmers start diversifying, does that massively complicate these calculations?
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. So farms can be footprinted in a variety of different ways. And so absolutely, for that individual farm, in terms of being able to show progress over time, for them, probably the best thing to do is to include everything that's going on, including all of their diversification businesses and those sorts of things, because that is their unique business. But actually, when you go outside of the farm and you start to think about, well, again, that farm is producing products. And for example, if that farm is producing wheat and barley and potentially some beef, then the people that are purchasing those products don't want to know that they've also got a diversification business, because it's not on the same, it's not part of their footprint. And that's one of the challenges that we have in terms of potentially some farms and some supply chains have been picking up certain bits of what's going on farm, for example, qualifying what's happening from an emissions perspective. But sometimes, and we've had standards in place to be able to do that. So we have PASS 2050, which basically is the set of standards and guidance that says if you want to conduct life cycle assessments, then this is what you do. The challenge that we have is that when we just do that at a product level, or sometimes at an enterprise level, that's a way of just being able to quantify the emissions. It's not doing anything from a sequestration perspective. So what we tend to have now in terms of with our supply chains, with our retailers, those sorts of things, they sort of are now starting to think potentially we need to adapt our metrics or adapt the way that we're collecting this information to also be able to take account of the other things that are happening on farm, which are from a positive perspective. And that's where we've got this slight difference. And again, a live example in terms of I was carbon footprinting a group of arable farms down in Pembrokeshire. And we had one of the farms that had a really high fuel level, and I couldn't quite work out what was going on. And we worked out that he'd diversified and he'd put a swimming pool on the farm, and it was all the heating for the swimming pool. But again, if you compared him to the other farms that didn't have that diversification, he was much higher than them. So it's very much about making sure that if you're comparing between a group of farms, you are comparing like with like. But if you're comparing yourself over time, and for you in terms of to provide that management input, then yeah, include everything on the farm, because there's probably things that you might want to do within your diversification business that otherwise are not going to get collected. So understanding the scale and the boundaries around what's included and what's not is also some of the complications, depending on what sort of standard or what level you're going to.
Okay, thanks. I can see Julian's got his hand up. Julian, would you like to?
Thank you. Yes. Wonderful. Thank you, Becky. I'm really pleased to hear all that's happening, and I think it's really important. A couple of sort of things to clarify. You mentioned about the soil carbon, and I wondered if you could say something about the way it plateaus and fluctuates as seasons go past, and how much you can build it up without establishing your own people.
Yeah, absolutely, really important. And again, if we look at I suppose what's been the focus in terms of sequestration, it's absolutely been around tree planting. Now you could say, well, why has it been around tree planting? Well, tree planting is really simple. There's a lovely spreadsheet that basically says if you plant this tree at this rate, this is how much carbon it will sequester, and there's very little, I suppose, uncertainty around that. As soon as we move into the area of soils, there is a huge amount of variation. So suddenly the development of a model is very, very challenging. Because, as I say, all soils are different depending on their underlying parent material, climatic conditions, all those other sorts of things. The other two key areas in terms of some of the challenges when we think about soil carbon, exactly as you say, Julian, is one around permanence. So actually, when we sequester that carbon and we think about the different pathways through which we can sequester that carbon into our soil, which I'll talk about in a sec, how long is that carbon going to be stored in that soil? Because we have a slight discrepancy here in terms of what we want in terms of for a farmer in terms of a healthy functioning soil is we actually want that carbon to be cycling. because it's that carbon cycling which actually is sustaining that system. It's supporting the biology, it's doing all those other sorts of things. Whereas the true definition of sequestration is that we take that carbon, we lock it in a box, it stays there, it does not come out forever. And a way of thinking about it a little bit is like if you went and you took a load of cash to the bank and you paid in 100 quid in 10 £10 notes, and then in another 10 years time you went and you got that £100 back out, it's not going to be the same £10 notes that you get back out. So that, you know, there is this difference about, it's probably not going to be the same carbon molecules that are there, but hopefully you are adding more carbon than is being used within that cycling process. The other important thing to remember is that it's also really important to look at where that carbon is stored within the soil profile. So a lot of the long-term research that has been taken place in places like Rothamsted and all of these sorts of things has only been focusing on the carbon in that shallower depths. Okay. What we do start to see, and what we see with our carbon projects, is that if you are putting those practices into place, which is encouraging deeper rooting species, is actually allowing those roots to go down and proliferate all the way through your soil, then we will start to build carbon in those lower depths of the soil. And it's a little bit like thinking again about your bank account. You've got your sort of current account, which is the top couple of inches of soil, and then you've got your savings account. And what we want to be happening through farmers management is we want some of that active cycling carbon, which very much you will get to a plateau because you're then going to match what's going on in terms of activity, to move down into that more long-term stable carbon, which is like your savings account. So the rate of carbon sequestration will slow down as the percentage of it goes up, but it's also really important to look at where that carbon is within your soil. And we've got some farms where we've been testing, you know, fields which have been permanent pasture for years, so arguably have reached that plateau, and they are still sequestering carbon, but that carbon is being sequestered at those lower depths. So it's again, thinking about what level are you sampling at to make sure you can account for where that carbon is.
Thank you. Should I just ask my other one quickly before I pass it?
Carry on.
So you mentioned about the NFU and their target for 2040, which is wonderful. The example you quoted was an arable farm, which is obviously a lot easier. And I'm just wondering, you know, how on earth they expect to do that, you know, given the other chart you showed showing the amount of methane there. And also just the other sort of part of that question really is, I mean, you mentioned the Miles Allen work at the University of Oxford, and you mentioned a headline figure of 1/10 of a degree difference. I mean, I think one of the problems is a trajectory, and I think, you know, in the short term, it certainly would have a bigger effect if everyone suddenly stopped emitting methane. I've heard, I mean, Andrew knows more, I think, of the, joined us, sadly missed the what you were saying about that, but I think, you know, it'd certainly have a bigger effect in the short term, and that's really important while we're sort of, you know, getting rid of our other oil emissions. And and the fact that methane is a short-term gas is good because it means you can sort of, and it has a quick effect. But the problem is, if you just keep on emitting it, then it has a bigger effect than you know, bigger proportionally than what we were saying. So those are my sort of concerns around methane.
Okay. So I think in terms of the NFU net zero strategy, they've basically got 3 pillars of activity in terms of where that's going to be. Number 1 is very much around productivity improvement. So that's doing more with less. That's the resource use efficiency piece. That's all of that sort of stuff. The second pillar very much is then around farm carbon storage. So how do we enhance carbon storage on farms through, you know, woodlands, hedgerows, soils, all that sort of stuff. The third pillar is very much around what's called bio-based economy measures. And a lot of those bio-based economy measures very much are still in the research lab at the moment. So they are not solutions which are ready to be taken up on farm. So there is very much still a little bit of a, we don't quite know yet in terms of how we're going to get there. And certainly, you know, we footprint and work with lots and lots of farms, and there is a real variation in terms of the ability for all farms to get to net zero. Now, I think we then have a challenge to think about the different nature of these gases. And I think, again, when we think about the ability of different sectors to get to net zero, if we then think about you know, the reliance on fossil fuels, actually you'll find that some of the sectors that are less potentially heavy emitters from methane, but are very much reliant on fossil fuels. I'm thinking about poultry, for example, where they tend to occupy quite a small area of land, so their ability to sequester carbon is very low, and they are very, very heavily reliant on fossil fuels in terms of a vast majority of their footprint is coming from feed and all of those sorts of things. So I would actually think that from the farms that we work with, you know, irrespective of which way we measure the methane, because also some of those farms where they potentially have a higher level of emissions, what they can do from a sequestration perspective is also good. It is really, really complicated. And on the methane modeling piece, there's two things there. I think firstly, we know that, again, if we apply that GWP star metric, it is less reliant on the absolute number of animals and more on how they're changing over time. And if we look at what's happening in terms of UK livestock numbers, those UK livestock numbers have been fairly static or slightly decreasing over time. So that, again, looks at what happens in terms of that methane trajectory. The second thing I would say with that, and it's just gone completely out of my head what I was about to say. No, it's gone, I'm afraid. Sorry, it'll come back to me in a sec. Apologies. It'll come back to me in a minute. Sorry.
Okay, Adrian, you've had your hand up for a long while, I think.
I have moments like that as well, so I have to write everything down all the time. Yeah, thanks, Becky. Great talk. So I think one of the key questions for me in regards to the tool is does it allow the user to change the GWE time horizon from 100 to 20 or 10, which are highly more relevant numbers than 100 to where we are currently?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that brings me very nicely to reflecting back what I was thinking about in my head. So absolutely, thank you for that. So the other thing I was just going to say was we need to also make sure on the other side that we don't focus on methane without also reducing our fossil fuel impact, because again, they're much more long-lived in the atmosphere. And what is the slight worry for me is that if we just focus on the methane without also concurrently reducing everything else, that we're going to lose the impact and we're going to sort of be seeing the impacts of that fossil fuel much further into the future. To come back to your question, Adrian, yes, absolutely. The challenge that we have with all of this sort of stuff is compliance with current standards. So the current standards, all the net zero projections, we have to report all of that using IPCC, using Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which says that we have to use GWP 100. What we do within our footprint, with our calculator, is that we offer the user the ability to apply different metrics to it. So we create a footprint that they can then use to comply with standards to, you know, fulfill requirements of their supply chain or whoever is asking them for their footprint. But we then go over and above those standards to help them to be able to understand all those other things, because the standards are actually not as nuanced as you would expect them to be for the sector. So in terms of understanding those sorts of differences, so we try and go over and above those, especially when we think about other bits around carbon sequestration, to make sure that the farmers, you know, understand where they have to report to using those current figures, but also how they can then make those better to be more reflective to what's happening on their farm, and have a better understanding of what's happening. So we absolutely do provide the ability to look at it through GWP 100, GWP star, GWP 20, but with the understanding that those are additional add-ons for the farms rather than what they have to do in terms of a reporting standard.
You're muted.
I didn't mute myself there. Yeah, so you could do a GWP 100 and then you could do A and other on top of that, and that could be GWP 10 as well.
We don't currently do GWP 10, but it's certainly something that we could do without too much of an issue.
Okay. And then I think another of the questions I think I saw in the chat is highly relevant to this one is, do you include the upstream fugitive emissions from methane and, well, oil, gas, wood and coal as well in your calcs?
So absolutely. So the footprints can, well, we do, the user can then specify how far they want to go down the supply chain. So what tends to happen is that the footprint most people tend to want to stop it at farm gate, because they've probably got less control over what happens when it leaves the farm in terms of distribution networks and those sorts of things. The calculations are there to be able to include onwards in terms of distribution, processing and end use if you want to, but what tends to happen for a farm scale one is that they tend to stop at farm gate.
I was thinking more the other way. So when we extract oil or gas from our North Sea, for instance, there's like anything, depending on what you read, anything from 2% to 12% by volume of the methane you use just goes directly into the atmosphere, courtesy of the way the industry works. And then when they clean the methane, they take the CO2 out and they vent that direct to the atmosphere at our onshoring hubs as well. So the question is, in your calculations, do you include the upstream emissions for your fuel, including natural gas and diesel?
Yes. So all of the scope 3 and the embedded emissions in terms of that manufacture and all of that is included.
Okay, that's cool. I shall hand over for someone else for the moment.
Thanks, Adrian. Jessica, I think you were next.
Thanks. Hi, Becky. It was really interesting talk. And as someone who also does carbon emissions, calculations, I understand how you can get quite into it. So I work for the Wildlife Trust, and we use tools that were developed by the Wildlife Trust, and they actually separated out our livestock calculations, or conservation grazing as we call it, last year. And we use a calculator we can pull off our figures and see whether, the standard number that we use is the GWP, the 100, but we can also see what GWP star does and all of that. So I just had a couple of sort of questions relating to the work that we do. And one is, so I've had people make the argument, or certainly heard the argument, that intensive livestock agriculture results in a lower footprint or lower emissions per animal. And my response is that, other environmental damage that is being done is not being included in that. I also wonder how carefully they're including waste, because in our calculations we look quite carefully at what we do with our livestock waste. So I wonder around that, if I don't know if you know much about that. And then the other thing is that actually the other question is about the carbon capture, so maybe I'll ask that after this.
So absolutely, I think, and it's specifically in relation to the way that carbon footprints have been done through the supply chain, where what they've been looking at is emissions intensity, so the emissions generated per kilo or per ton of output. And so what they try and do is they say, well, actually, if you produce more, then actually, you are spreading those emissions over a wider tonnage. And it's been done both in beef systems, where again, the National Beef Association has come out and said that the best mechanism to produce beef in a climate friendly way is to actually feed it and get it gone quick. Because it is then alive for less days, and therefore it's producing methane for less days. And again, this is all reliant on the different weightings of the gases over 100 years. So even if you have to bring in more food to feed those animals that has got a higher fossil fuel input, in terms of either it's got land use change, or it's got land disturbance, or fertilizer, or all those sorts of things, because of the weighting that they put to methane, those things are seen as you have to almost do 30 times more feed to then equate the equivalence of the animal. The other challenge with those calculations is exactly as I said a minute ago. They have just been looking at emissions intensity, so they haven't been looking at the value of those animals in the landscape and what they might be doing from a sequestration perspective. So if we're just looking at how do we produce those ruminant products in the most emissions efficient way, then absolutely we stick them in a shed. We get them growing quickly, or we get them producing a huge amount of milk, and then we get those animals gone, and we employ all of the tech that we can to scrub the methane out of the, do all of those sorts of things. But it is a very, very narrow view. And it's just looking at emissions. It's not thinking about the role of some of those other things that are going on. It's also not thinking about potentially some of those knock-on impacts in terms of what we're then going to do with all of that slurry, for example, and the wider water quality or diffuse pollution issues that are coming from there. So these are some of the challenges in terms of why there aren't those easy answers when we come to agriculture, because we don't just have one system of producing things, we have multiple different systems, and again we have an evolving measurement system that potentially doesn't look at these things in the round. It tends to focus on one metric, and I'll give you a really live example of that at the moment. We've got within dairy, where we've got some some processors that have been looking at emissions intensity, and so they have been incentivizing their farmers to come away from grass and stick them in and get more milk production, which has done what they've needed to do in terms of emissions reductions. But now those farmers are also being asked to deliver for biodiversity, and they've now changed their systems away from what they can deliver in terms of some of those other environmental outputs, because they've been favoring carbon. So what we would always say is that we look at each farming system and what that farming system can deliver. Yes, our focus is carbon, but it's carbon in the round rather than just emissions. So looking at how that farm can deliver both for emissions reductions, but also in terms of enhanced carbon storage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why we have livestock. It's to provide the biodiversity and conservation benefits. Thanks. And my other question was just around the carbon capture. So in your calculator, you're using the kind of permanent sequestration, because what we've tried to do, so we produce an annual footprint, and in that we have the figure of carbon that we think is sort of being permanently taken out of the atmosphere and stored below ground. And then we try, with the extremely limited research there is, to work out on a yearly basis what might be captured or given off by particular habitats, which is really tricky. There's not much data around. If you know of any, then please share, especially around grassland. We struggle, and obviously in Wiltshire we have a lot of grassland, so a lot of our habitat is that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really challenging. And again, it comes back to what I was saying earlier about, the difference between, forest habitats or those sorts of things, and then grassland, because there are so many variations. They've started to do obviously a bit of work within arable in terms of, looking at aligning with things like soil carbon code for reduction in cultivation and planting cover crops and those sorts of things. But we're much further behind within grassland. Well, I mean, the data that we tend to work off is, we have Natural England work within the calculator that looks at this, the stewardship sequestration within stewardship options. So we can assign for some of that there, and that has things like if you're putting more diversity into grasslands and moving to GS4s and those sorts of things. But we also, as I say, because we've been doing soil carbon project for a few years now, about 8 years, we've got some quite good understanding, and we use that as a sort of model. We would also, be advising all of our farmers to start baselining, because I think that's the best information that you can have is what's happening on your farm with your management and how that's changing over time. There is, and then there's always that conversation about, as I say, not just how much carbon is there, but where is that carbon, and if we're seeing that change in some of those deeper depths, then we can be more confident that that's going to stay there for a little bit longer than potentially that carbon that's in that top those top top couple of inches. Where, and interestingly, what we found is that where we've had these interesting weather conditions, is that actually for some farms that have been really implementing some of these sort of regenerative type approaches, they have very much been maintaining carbon, because a lot of other people have been losing it because of the weather conditions, and the ones that have been doing very well are the ones that have just been safeguarding the carbon that they've got. So it's not a linear thing in terms of you will sequester this much every year. It's about understanding where you are, what you're doing from a management perspective and how that feeds together.
Thank you.
Jessica, I think sorry, not Sylvia Wyatt, I think, but you were next. You've got some things in the
Jeremy.
chat.
Sure. Yes.
Sorry?
No, I asked a few questions in the chat.
Yes, you've got some stuff in the chat. You've got
to go to a meeting. So first of all, fascinating talk. But as always, when you're trying to model and almost come up with a single number describing a very complex multi-axial system, there is a risk of gaming.
Yeah.
And you gave a perfect example of some industrial farmers gaming the system and concluding that actually their product was less carbon intensive than someone who's got their cows out to grass all year round. So there is clearly a risk of people picking on, for example, nitrous oxide might be the most obvious one, particularly the cost of fertilizer, cutting their fertilizer use, but increasing their increasing their carbon emissions, doing deep ploughing or something like that. Although of course that might also increase their nitrogen. But so I think that is a risk, and we've seen this in the past with EPCs.
Yeah,
developers putting up blocks of housing with 2 or 4 solar panels per house, but not paying any attention to insulation, just installing standard gas combi boilers. And because of the way the EPC calculator works, it turns out that they get a better environmental rating. So I guess the broad question is, how can you minimize that risk of gaming?
So I think it goes back to something I said earlier about making sure that we come away from just looking at a single emissions per product, and we start very much to look much more at emissions at a farm level or on a hectare basis. I would always argue that actually we need to do emissions per ton of product because we are generating these emissions because we're producing something, but we also need to look at it on an emissions per hectare basis. And what I look at when I do work with farms is that we look at how different those are, because coming back to what Jessica was saying earlier, you might have an extensive conservation grazing system where actually their emissions per hectare are very low, but their emissions per ton are very high because they're not producing very much out of the end of it. But it's balancing between those two, which is really important. And also, again, asking the questions about who is asking you to do the footprint, what potentially are they trying to advocate out of the end of it. And coming right back to when Claire was talking about her example earlier, for the farmers, the best scape to do it on is for your farm, because then you're not gaming the system. You've got no one to really game against. It's about understanding how you're making progress over time. But there are certain things. So for example, another example of that is that actually, where do you allocate certain things? Because, for example, there was another report that came out that said that the most efficient, another one talking about efficient beef, the most efficient beef was actually beef that came out of the dairy herd. And basically what they'd done was they'd basically apportioned all the emissions to do with raising that calf to the dairy herd. So it was basically coming into the beef system scot-free without any. So there's all those sorts of things. And I think the more it's really complicated, but what's really encouraging is that more people are questioning some of these things, and actually, we are getting more knowledge and understanding about the nuance. The other thing I would say is that, and we do it and we are advocating this, and actually NFU and AHDB are advocating it as well, is that, rather than always relying on that single metric in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent, we also start to report the gases separately for agriculture, so that actually we can understand the nuance behind that. And then, as you say, if we've got something where a farmer's doing something which is massively increasing his carbon but reducing something else, we can understand that and see what the reason is for that.
Thank you. I think Mel was next. I'm not too sure, but I think you were next, Mel. What's your question?
Thanks. Well, I just wanted to ask about the potential for electric vehicles on farms, actually, and whether farmers are interested in them. Are there electric tractors and things to reduce the diesel use, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've started to see a little bit more, not so much in terms of tractors, because they do need quite a lot of power in terms of to do those field operations. But what we are starting to see a little bit more of is electric quad bikes, electric gators. So the things that farmers are traveling around the farm checking stock and those sorts of things, they are becoming much more widely seen. We have got one of the farms that we work with in Cornwall. So they have covered their slurry store, and they are capturing the methane that's produced within that slurry store, and Cornwall Council are using that methane. They're cleaning that methane, and they've got putting that into the council vehicles that are going around repairing potholes on the road. So there is a potential untapped resource in terms of, through covering our slurry stores and being able to capture the methane that's produced there, we can use that. And New Holland have just got a pilot tractor that is also using that to fuel that tractor. So I wonder whether when we get to the sort of size of tractors, potentially we're not going to be so much in terms of from an electrification perspective, but potentially thinking about methane fuel tractors or hydrogen or those sorts of things, they may well be something that will come down the line. Because what we've also seen is that we either, you know, get to the point where we stick to the size of machine that we've got at the moment, in which case very much we're then thinking about hydrogen or methane. Or, you know, if you look at what's going on at Harper Adams in terms of we start employing robots to do the jobs for us, and then that's, you know, we're thinking much more small scale, and those robots run up and down the rows of crops and pick the weeds and all of those sorts of things. And, you know, in horticulture, we've got quite a few robots that are picking crops, and those are all electric. So if we go sort of small, you know, individual plant management, then that's very much at a robotic stage. If we're sticking to the sort of field scale operations, I think we're very much going to be thinking about some of those alternative fuel sources.
Thank you, Vicky. Andrew, I think you were next.
Thank you. Hello. First of all, hello, Becky, and apologies I arrived late. I'm using someone else's laptop, and I'll launch in, but I need to give you a bit of context. And I'll just dismiss a couple of side concerns. And one is that soil organic carbon is one of the most volatile ways of trapping carbon. All it takes is it improves the soil, doesn't it? And all it takes is for the next tenant or the next person who buys the land to exploit that improved soil, and there your carbon's gone. Scientists are now talking about which are the most long-lived trees and how can we sequester carbon for 1,000 years, because well, the climate emergency is going to be ongoing. My next side concern is the way that the National Farmers Union and the American intensive beef industry are using GWP star. They're using it to be able to say we are making no net extra contribution to climate change. And of course, the role of methane producers is not to make no net contribution, it's to drastically cut global heating. And you know that if we drop methane levels quickly enough in this decade, we can actually lower the temperature of the planet. So no net contribution isn't the same as a net contribution to tackling the climate crisis. So I want to talk about methane, and I will come to a question, I promise you. It's not the case that you are bound to use the greenhouse gas protocol. It's not the case that IPCC is telling us to use this or that metric. In fact, the latest science reports from the IPCC are saying that you should use the carbon dioxide equivalent, which in the case of methane and to some extent nitrous oxide is in terms of time, that suits the context. And we're in the context of massive climate emergency, unprecedented global heating this year alone, global temperatures, blah, 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 emergencies, disasters, and so on. And the COPs are not even slowing down the rate of emission of greenhouse gases. So methane is a subject of the methane, the International Global Methane Protocol. It should be getting reported separately. And from what the IPCC scientists are saying, the 20-year CO2 equivalent of methane is much more relevant to the situation we in the UK, we in the global farming and fossil fuel community and consumers are in. And just to give an example to you all, if you switch, you've got a lovely pie chart on your page called greenhouse gas emissions. And if you switch from the 100-year equivalent of methane to the 20-year equivalent, which is 80 something, then instead of methane being 57% of UK farm emissions, it becomes 80%. CO2, instead of being 16%, becomes 8%, and NO2 instead of 28% becomes 14%. So 80% in terms of our 20-year horizon of UK farm emissions are methane, which is and a cow is doing all the emissions work of 2 or 3 standard British cars driving standard British mileage. It makes me feel bad when I look at a field of cows. If they're hidden away in a shed, those intensive farmers are not saying they're more carbon efficient. They're saying that it's more climate efficient to grow cows and feed them feed and slaughter them quickly. And they're correct. technically. Organic farming has a lot of land use. It has a climate problem, in fact. So I really I felt that some of the things you're saying, I took them as provocative. It's disgraceful that we should be using the 100-year equivalent without servicing and debating those issues. We should be reporting methane separately. British farmers should all be reporting methane separately. And if they want to use the 100-year equivalent, we should be asking them to use the 20-year equivalent or the instantaneous equivalent, which is 50% higher again. Because what matters to me is how much global warming is that field or barn full of cattle causing this year from when it was produced, when the methane was produced. That's what matters now in the climate emergency. So do you accept, Becky, that
Sorry, I was going to say, you're coming to your question, Andrew.
do you accept that we should be reporting methane separately, that methane emissions in the short term are the huge majority of UK farming emissions, because I think 70% of our land is used for livestock and feed. And would you, if I can be provocative in turn, would you accept that looking at the minor emissions, which are the carbon emissions from farms, is a bit like airports trying to reduce their carbon footprint, and the elephant in the room being the actual planes that take off?
Okay, so right, so a couple of things there. I think firstly, I suppose just to come back on a couple of bits, you know, we have to report using GWP 100. There is change happening, but
Is
at the
that
moment,
is that a legal requirement?
yeah. And certainly in terms of when our calculator and when the other calculators are assessed by the Carbon Trust in terms of alignment with the protocols and the standards, we have to report to GWP 100. That is, you know, there is obviously within the IPCC AR6, you know, there is change coming, and as you've said, global methane pledge, all that sort of stuff, absolutely change is happening. What I also said earlier is I would absolutely be an advocate of reporting those gases separately. We do already report those gases separately, as well as obviously combining them in terms of their carbon dioxide equivalent. So I think from that side, the more nuanced reporting that we can come up with, the better.
And you haven't said that you have to only report using that standard and the 100-year equivalent, or that you only have to report using greenhouse gas protocol, which is 20-something years old, have you?
No, but if we are wanting, you know, if we're wanting to align with the standards that farmers have to report to, and what all of our current all of the net zero legislation is written off GWP 100, all of our targets, all of our carbon budgets are all written on the impact of these gases over 100 years. So there is going to be a lot of change needed in terms of being able to update that science. And, you know, it will update, it will improve. We will get better understanding of the impact of these gases over the short term and over the long term. In terms of the role of ruminant animals, I have a slightly different view to you, and it's all right. We're all able to have different views and all those sorts of things in terms of their role in warming the planet. You know, if we look at what's happened in terms of global temperature rise since the Industrial Revolution, there are lots of different things that have gone on. If we look at livestock numbers, all of those sorts of things, you know, what we're trying to do in terms of the work that we do supporting farmers is to help them understand how to optimize their system, and how to optimize their system from a resource use efficiency perspective, from a management of natural cycles perspective. How can we use our animals in terms of our grazing practices and all those sorts of things. Now, that's not to say that, you know, I can point you to, you know, lots of examples of farms where they are doing really good job, and lots of examples of farms where they've got lots of things that they could still do, and that's both within an intensive and an extensive system. So
I guess
sorry.
Yes, I guess I was thinking that the keyword carbon in your name meant that you were focusing above all on the British agriculture's contribution to the climate emergency.
So we absolutely are, but we are also helping empower those farmers to understand what can they do, and what those options will be. And I think in terms of, you know, if we accept the fact that a lot of farmers that are livestock farms, you know, aren't going to massively stop being livestock farms, how do we allow those to optimize their system while we get more nuanced understanding around what's happening around the different gases? So
Okay,
I think, sorry, carry on.
Well, there's I'm sorry to cut in so eagerly. There's a difference between having different views and tolerating alternatives to the facts, alternative facts. Our valuation of methane and the importance of methane emissions is one thing, but the facts about how much it warms the planet isn't something where we can have a broad church of different opinions. It's science. But I cut you off.
Absolutely.
Yes. And the carbon the protocol is 20 years. It dates 20 or more years back through the climate emergency to when we knew a lot less. And I'll just try and I'll shut up by clicking mute on myself. And I
Sorry,
just
guys,
wondered
can I
whether you
interrupt a
support
minute
the
there?
climate and nature bill, because I think most of us do, and I think it'll help us to do that thing of having to report the greenhouse gases separately. Thanks.
Sorry, Andrew, can I interrupt a minute? I've got a problem with my headphones. So could we go on to a question from Ros? Sorry, I missed a bit because my batteries have gone. So Ros, would you like to ask your question? I'll just be back on stream in a moment.
Oh, you're on mute, Ros.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Hello, Becky. Nice to hear from you. I did communicate with you some years ago about confounding factors in discussions about food and farming, and so it's nice to meet you and hear your very interesting talk. I think just in relationship to the last point, there's a lot of reports from farmers in the mainstream farming press now about how reintroducing grazing into specialist arable farms is helping the health of the soil.
Absolutely.
Over and beyond regenerative farming techniques, such as cover crops, etc., minimal ploughing, minimal tillage. And also helping with cut the pesticides and the herbicides and so on. So I think they're managing to radically decrease the agrochemicals while improving crop health and the, what am I trying to say? Crop health and yield.
Yep.
But my question relates back to what you mentioned about the measurement of emissions per ton. And I think there is work going on at UN level to look at seeing whether emissions per nutrient density can be measured, which would be quite different again.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating area of development. There was some work done in the States by a guy called Dan Kittredge, who was very much looking at the nutrient density of predominantly fruit and veg, actually. And again, a lot of the work that we do in terms of quantifying the benefits of practices in the soil, actually, if you can completely bypass the difficultness that's going on in the soil and just look at, the nutrient density of the product, then, it provides a really interesting way in terms of selling that story to consumers and more widely. And they've certainly found that actually, yeah, if you are growing, they did a lot of work on carrots. If you were growing carrots in a way which was very soil friendly, nutrient cycling, all those sorts of stuff, then actually, the consumers could taste the difference in the carrots, but also they were measuring Brix levels and all those sorts of things to be able to show the difference. I think nutrient density is a really interesting one. I think, again, some of the early work actually was quite inconclusive around whether you could differentiate, especially they did some work on milk. But I think we need to look a lot more in terms of, rather than just, we don't buy things because we want to eat it per ton. We buy it because we want to eat it because of the taste or what it's providing for us in terms of health benefits or nutrients. So why can't we develop the metric to do that? And I think that will be a big game changer in terms of when we can get to a point where those metrics can also be included. I think we just need to to a point where we can do it in a cost-effective way, and be able to understand the seasonal variation and all those sorts of bits. But absolutely, it's something I'm really optimistic and excited about, because I think it provides a way to talk to consumers in a way they'll understand, in terms of, you know, if you go back a few years, they started putting carbon footprints on products and then took them off because they realized that nobody really understood what they were or what it meant or those sorts of things, where I think if we can align it with nutritional quality, I think that's really exciting.
Thank you.
Great. Becky, we've gone far beyond what I promised you. Jackie's got her hand up, and I don't think has asked you anything before. So can we be brief now? You seem to be sitting on a staircase, so I'm
Oh, sorry,
conscious
I'm trying to keep the internet. Sorry.
Yeah, that's really great, but I'm conscious you might not be very comfortable
it's
where
fine.
you are. And my apologies for my my sort of interruption of everybody earlier. I just went flat and I couldn't hear what was going on. So apologies to Andrew and to you for whatever happened to you, what was happening to me. So Jackie, but can we please be conscious of the time now for poor Becky on her staircase?
I've got quite a general question, because when we're trying to communicate changes that we want people to make to reduce their carbon emissions, moving to a plant-based diet, or at least eating less red meat, is really important. It's also very good for their own health, as we know nowadays. But the first reaction that comes from pretty well all levels is, but we must support the farmers. If we stop eating beef, if we stop eating chicken, we're not supporting the farmers. Now, I'm aware, as I think was mentioned before, quite a lot of our current UK land use is growing crops for stock. If we reduced our stock, and there are areas, I was a vet, so I do understand how things work, but are there areas that we could actually grow vegetable crops and cereal crops to feed humans? Can we replace that while still keeping stock levels maybe on the more marginal lands, or using stock as part of a rotation system to fertilize instead of using the fertilizers? Is that a viable solution?
Absolutely. It's
and how do farmers feel about that?
Yeah, it's and farmers are absolutely moving in that direction. You know, it's absolutely bonkers.
Sorry, Becky, we just lost you when you were going to say it's absolutely bonkers. What? Sorry. I'm back. Sorry, I wasn't running away. You just got to absolutely bonkers, Becky.
Sorry.
Yeah,
it's absolutely bonkers sometimes in terms of the crops that we grow, because often they have a real damaging from an environmental perspective. We think about things like maize, if we think about some of those other products, which again, you know, we are predominantly growing for livestock food. So absolutely, you know, I'm really positive about the fact that, you know, we can free up some of that land. But I think also in terms of farmers' willingness to do that, I think for no other reason, the economics are going to help draw that, because if you think about what's happening in terms of changes in subsidy system, you know, actually the marginal cost availability to be able to do sorts of things, you know, what is the most cheapest crop to feed your animals is grass. So actually, you know, the ability to bring in large quantities of cereals to put them through an inefficient digestion system, you know, is going to become less and less possible from an economic perspective, irrespective of everything else that's going on. So I think there is, you know, the need to think about how do we manage the land uses in this country that will allow us to do those other things. What I would just say from a slight from the other side, is if we're very much thinking about carbon, not some of the other greenhouse gases, but predominantly focusing on carbon, and carbon losses, some of the worst losses from soils come within intensive horticulture. So, you know, we work with some farms where, you know, they are quite happily losing, you know, 10 tons of carbon per hectare per year in terms of intensive cultivation, because they need stale seed beds and, you know, all of these other sorts of things. So I think horticulture has a very good role to play. We all need to obviously eat more fruit and veg, local, seasonal, all that sort of stuff, but we need to make sure that we have innovative solutions for how we manage field scale veg in a way which protects the soil and allows us to deal with, diseases in a way which doesn't require sterilization and all those other sorts of things, because it's often not soil, it's dirt, it's a medium to grow stuff in, and actually bringing some life back into it is really important.
Okay, Adrian, Bill has got his hand up.
Hey,
Adrian's
no,
got it. Adrian, can I
Adrian
just
first.
check?
Adrian first.
Adrian,
Okay.
you'd already asked something, but Bill, you've not spoken before. That's my only
Oh,
thought.
it's
But
all right. I'll come
is it a
back in a
follow on
minute.
to your
No problem.
previous question, Adrian?
Okay, yeah. So just to segue on from what you just said there, Becky. So carbon credits is obviously a way that a farmer can diversify and still maintain revenue. And soil sampling is key to that.
Yep.
As is tree growing, as is hedge growing. And the concept of carbon credits is quite well established. But if we look closer at the soil and we look at it from a life perspective rather than just a growing construct, then the vast majority of or a lot of carbon can be stored in the soil by an explosion of living things occurring in effectively what's a dead soil, like an intensive horticulture field. So my question is there any noise yet about claiming biodiversity net gain credits for the content of below the ground soil as opposed to just the carbon?
No, but it's really interesting in terms of, absolutely, because if you change your practices and you and you suddenly introducing a lot more, then it's an explosion of the microbial life. We know that there's more life in the soil than there are people on the planet. It's hugely diverse, but a lot of the biodiversity net gain stuff at the moment is very much focusing on above ground biodiversity. It's not looking at what's happening within our soils. But I think it's a really exciting opportunity to think about that biology part of it, because, as I say, we don't even know the half of what some of that biology is doing, but it's incredibly diverse, and the more that we can work with the biology. And as I say, some of the really forward-thinking farmers that I work with now have done huge amounts of things in terms of reducing inputs, have maintained yields, have done all those things, and they've done it because they're focusing on it from a biological perspective, and how do they unlock the power of their soils through changing their management. So I think it's a really interesting point. At the moment, as I say, biodiversity is very much focusing on, or BNG is very much focusing on above ground, but I don't know whether the DEFRA biodiversity metric would cope with below ground biodiversity. It might explode their model, but we can hope.
Okay, so it's not something you've ever heard of out there in the big wide world.
No.
Okay. All right. Yep. Thanks for that. Just wondering.
Okay. Bill,
Yeah, Adrian, that's something you could launch out into the big wide world then.
Oh yes, I'm very much working on it.
I'm sure you are. Yeah.
Sorry, just to add a warning, it's
Becky.
7:30. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Ring the bell.
Becky, it's been a brilliant evening. I think it's amazing, and you've been able to answer 99% of the questions. Maybe Andrew would like another 3 hours with you, but let's keep it at this. I've got a couple of high-level questions, really. What percentage of farms are you engaged with in terms of land area?
So
after the UK, I mean, not for the world.
Yeah, so I don't actually know in terms of land area. We have about 10,500 farmers using the calculator. probably 95% of those are UK farms. We do have a few that are overseas, but we have a lot of that. It's interesting in terms of, so those are the ones that are using the calculator as a tool. We work with some other farms specifically on things around soil health or changings and those sorts of things. So absolutely not all of them, but we have big ambitions, and we are happy to work in partnership with others and those sorts of things. So I do a lot of these sorts of talky type things. So it might be that we don't interact on a one-to-one basis, but we try and help empower farmers to understand their potential for changing and measurements and these sorts of things. And we've not stopped yet. We're going to keep going. So we will. I'll talk to anybody who wants to talk to me about carbon from a So yeah, they only have to show us a modicum of enthusiasm, and they won't get rid of me. So
the question then is, of the ones that you are engaged with through the footprint or whatever, or the measurements or whatever, how many are actively engaged with you in actually dealing with the problem rather than just having to report figures?
The vast majority are, because what we do, there's no need to do our calculator. You know, we're not a supermarket, we're not a regulator, we're not a verifier. So farmers come to us because they're interested most of the time. Some people do come because they're using it for something else, but the vast majority is because they're interested. So they're not being threatened with a stick. And again, what they tend to find is that sometimes it can be a little bit scary and a little bit overwhelming at that first point, but then actually when they dig into it and they realize, as I say, the magic really happens when you start to show them their ability to change things, and then they start to go, oh well, what about if I did that, or what about if I did that, and it becomes something that they can get quite interested in and show the impact over time. And then what we try and do is that we empower some of those farmers that are super keen to sort of then bring the ones along that are less keen. And certainly I saw something there in terms of in Wiltshire, we do quite a lot of work with a couple of clusters in Wiltshire. So we've got a cluster in the Pewsey Vale cluster, and there's another one that I work with as well. And we've done baseline footprinting, and then we go back and we then talk to them about soils or those sorts of things. And again, they're seeing it. We work with a lot of farmers across landscapes, because again, sort of aligning back to what we were saying earlier about actually, if we're looking at potential markets or opportunities for things to change, one individual farm on its own is great, but actually if you can bring them together across a landscape, suddenly you're doing things at scale, and you can start to stack things on top of each other around emissions reductions, improvements in sequestration, biodiversity, water quality, and all those sorts of things. So we're seeing that that's potentially quite a useful mechanism to start to pull together some of those environmental benefits that actually then seem useful from a not so much a buying marketplace, but it gives you a more cumulative impact.
Okay.
Right. I'm going to stop there, if I may, for Becky's sake. I don't know if the hands up are still hands up or just
I'll take mine down. I
tired
would have
hands
preferred
up.
to ask a couple more, but don't worry.
Yeah, okay. Becky, thank you so much. You've been really generous with your time, and you adventurous with your positioning, as far as I can see, as to keep the signal going for us. So thank you so much for that. I'm sure there's lots more we could talk about in relation to farming, but it's really nice to be having such an enthusiastic and positive presentation. It was really interesting and so important, I think, from farmers' perspectives. They've got a body like yours that they can is not beating them with a stick or haranguing them or what else, because I just get the impression that's how farmers feel at the moment, particularly with the the tax situation and all the rest of it. So thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for being so generous with your time for us.
No worries.
Do feel free to log out and leave your staircase. I just wanted to ask everybody else just a couple of things, or
Thank you
ask if
very
anybody
much.
else wanted to raise anything else. Thank you so much, Becky.
No
That's been a
worries. Thank
great
you.
evening.
Bye.
Thank you. Yes, the thing that's I wanted to mention to everybody is about hopefully our next talk. We've got the perennial November problem of when we have the next talk, because of the dreaded C word for Christmas. Do people feel a talk in December would be doable for people? Because it would be the 16th of December normally, with the third Monday of the month. Or do we feel December is just a no-go zone? The prospective speaker I've got is Andy Wallace of the Environment Agency, who's been overseeing the river park and flood works in Salisbury. So I thought he would be an interesting speaker in terms of communities and flooding and so on. But do we think that if we have a meeting in December, everybody else will be doing their Christmas shopping, or what do we think? I think everybody more or less is muted, so I can't hear anybody. Please do turn off and chip in.
I think 16th is a bit close to Christmas personally.
Personally, would be very happy.
I'm
You'd be
happy to
happy,
do
Jackie?
16.
Very happy
What-
to come on 16th, yes.
Me too.
What do you think? Sorry, were you sort of not thinking that, Julian?
No, but don't worry about that. I mean, I will do if that's what we go with.
Okay,
I think
it's
the
just
majority vote around here was yes, do it in December.
the majority vote was yes. So I'll see if he can do it. The January date would be the 20th. Oh yes, and that's a possible no-go. It's my birthday, so I don't.
We
get a date.
demand a meeting. So we can give you 3 cheers.
Oh, that's very good. I mean, it might be completely irrelevant, but I just didn't really want that. But then I thought perhaps we'd have a totally different day. If he said I can't do that date, but I could do some other January, are people stuck on the 3rd Monday? I'm not sure if he's going to disappear off our scene here in Salisbury when he signs off the river park. That's what I'm worrying about. What do you think if in January, December, January time we had a different scheduling
So
of
it wouldn't
the
matter too
Landuse
much,
meeting?
Claire, as long as we gave everybody enough notice.
Yeah, agree with that.
It'll be
Everybody
fine.
feel like that? But
Yeah.
probably stick to a Monday to see if he can do another Monday if he can't do that one. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Any other topics? No, I've got that off my worry list.
Well, I would just ask anyone who's got any ideas about having future talks about anything at all.
Sorry,
at
Ben,
least
I
Claire
can't
knows.
hear you very well. Sorry,
I
how
was
we
saying
can
is
do
if
what?
anyone else has any good ideas about speakers we might have, then please stick it in to me or Claire or Julian particularly. So yeah, it'd be useful to have a wider view because finding new speakers for various things is sometimes quite tricky. So, and we did say we try and do it bi-monthly unless there was an urgent need to have another type of talk. So we're saying we'll have one in December, which is fine by me. I mean, I don't mind, but we need to have time to sort out the next one. So people who've got any ideas, give us one. In fact, make a pledge that you will.
Yes, ongoing suggestions would be really, really helpful. What people would like to hear about.
Yeah.
I don't know whether the government is going to produce its land use plan or strategy before Christmas, as promised. I don't know if anybody knows about that. But once that comes out, that might be interesting if we can find somebody who knows about such topics or can speak to that. But anyway, yes, indeed, any suggestions would be really welcome.
Another thing I was just going to ask about is, I mean, Jess, you mentioned about the work that the Wildlife Trust are doing on soil carbon and things and carbon footprint. Is that in a state where it would be good to talk about it, or do you not really yet?
I mean, we're not actually doing much around soil carbon as far as I'm aware. Yeah, I would say that our website has got some updated that. Yeah, probably.
Are you doing PNG stuff?
There may be so we've been feeding in. So as I said, the Wildlife Trust Federation developed this tool for livestock grazing, and that we're about to submit the figures for the 2nd year for that, and that's going off to be kind of peer reviewed and all of that. So if anything comes out of that is circulated or put in the public domain, I can share that. Yeah.
So Jess, from a BNG point of view, are you as an organisation, what do they call it, an assessor or something? Do you do that?
We actually set up one of the pilot projects, I think, for BNG. The Bristol Avon catchment market.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't. I'm a bit out of touch with sort of what exactly is that project is, what stage they're at or anything. I think they've had a few market rounds, but
yeah. If anyone is able to talk about that to us, that would be useful too, actually, even if it's in the new year.
Yeah, they may be able to. We've just recruited, or yeah, we've been recruiting for a director of nature recovery, so that includes that team. So there's quite a lot happening at the moment. So potentially in the new year or a few months in, yeah, I'm not sure I can't remember the date the new director's starting, but yeah, potentially in the next year. I'd say at the moment they're an extremely busy team and a small, relatively small team. But I'm sure next year someone would be able to come and talk at some point.
Okay, and
we had so I was going to say we had Hannah Needham talking last time, and that was, I was conscious of that because it was quite time getting the landscape recovery information all up to a point where she could really speak to it. So that presumably is the same team, is it?
Yeah, Hannah's part of
project.
the water team, which is part of, it comes under the nature recovery section.
Yes, Jess, the other thing on your community energy scheme is there, are you running agro PV, for example? Are you doing multiple uses of the land, or are you just doing solar farms and they are allowed to run wild, or how are you're not actually providing a farming element to it, are you?
Yes, we do. So at one of our sites we have had sheep on. We're actually changing the grazing regime to only have them on over the winter, to try and increase biodiversity. And at our other bigger site, Braden, we're actually looking to be able to start putting sheep on there, and we've been talking to a local grazier. But yeah, we do a variety of sort of land management approaches there, in terms of trying to actively sort of increase biodiversity on both those sites. But yeah, also obviously trying to combine it with the sheep, with grazing.
Another thing would be nice to have a talk about.
Yes,
I'm just adding
I can ask. Yeah, I can certainly ask. Yeah.
Sorry, Julian, are we still recording? Sorry, Bill, are we still recording?
Yeah, I'll stop now.
Stop if we're just sort of we're getting sort of chit chat stage.
Okay.
But